Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, and I am so glad that you joined us today for CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. Before we jump into this week's interview, I want to encourage you to take a couple of minutes out of your busy schedule and please think about how CMDA has been influential in your life. How have you been educated, encouraged, and equipped through CMDA's ministries to bring the hope and healing of Christ to your world? That's our mission here at CMDA, to educate, encourage, and equip you, friends, to glorify God. And we'd like to hear from you. Would you consider sharing your CMDA story with us so that we can hear how Christ is moving through this ministry? There's going to be a special opportunity for you to share your CMDA story at the upcoming 2023 CMDA National Convention. So start thinking about it now. And if you'd like to share your story with us directly, then you can email cmdamatters@cmda.org. I can't wait to hear your story and hear how CMDA is impacting you. In this week's episode, I am joined by Rich Stearns, who's the President Emeritus of World Vision US. Rich is one of our plenary speakers next week at the CMDA National Convention, and this is a great opportunity for you to hear more from him about the importance of Christian leadership in the workplace. And whether that's a secular environment or a ministry environment, this is for you. You'll hear a seasoned and wise man of God today who took one of the world's largest faith-based nonprofits to new levels of impact on a global scale. So let's listen in together. Well, today on CMDA Matters, it is my wonderful privilege to have the President Emeritus of World Vision US, Mr. Richard Stearns. He continues to share his influence by writing and speaking on behalf of maybe the world's largest Christian nonprofit organization, World Vision. He has had the longest tenure of any president in its global history, serving for 20 years from 1998 to 2018. Rich actually holds a BA in neurobiology from Cornell University, as well as an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He joined World Vision to follow what he felt as a distinct call from God on his life, leaving a long and distinguished corporate career that included CEO roles at Lennox, they make China, and Parker Brothers Games. He was also with Gillette for a while, as well as the Franklin Mint. Over his 2 decades with World Vision, Rich built a very strong leadership team that focused on bringing corporate best practices that he learned in his previous career into the nonprofit sector. He's been to 60 of the nearly 100 countries in which World Vision has a presence and has been in the media, major media outlets. He's also an author and actually has an award-winning, best-selling book. I think he got the Evangelical Publishers Association 2010 Book of the Year Award for writing The Hole in Our Gospel around 2010. He's also written Unfinished and a couple of books with his wife, Renee, a couple of children's books. Rich and Renee, they live in Bellevue, Washington, have 5 grown children and 5 grandchildren. So without any further ado, thank you, Rich, for fitting time this afternoon into a conversation with me.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Mike. I'm looking forward to the conference in just a few weeks.
And Rich is referring to our national convention. He will be our leadoff hitter, if you will, in our Thursday evening plenary session, and also sharing in a couple of other venues there while with us in Cincinnati. Rich, I'm not sure how big the club is with nonprofit Christian leaders who have a distinguished career not only in Christian nonprofit, but also in the corporate business world that you're very proud of. So how many others are there out there like you?
Well, increasingly, there are more and more. And, I think I was one of the early adopters, if you will, of moving from a corporate career to a ministry career. But my good friend Jonathan Reckford moved from, I think he worked for Circuit City, and now he's the CEO of Habitat for Humanity. Mm-hmm. Good Christian guy, doing a fabulous job at Habitat. My successor at World Vision is a man named Edgar Sandoval, who did 20 years plus at Procter & Gamble before coming to World Vision. So those are just a few examples, but I think more and more boards of Christian nonprofits are realizing that running a Christian nonprofit requires a fair amount of sophistication around management, leadership, running a business, financial acuity. And so there used to be a day when most of the leaders of these nonprofits might have been retired pastors or mid-career pastors. And some of them still are and are doing a wonderful job, but they don't tend to have the business training and rigor that these larger organizations sometimes demand.
Well, in your book that I want to get our listeners, some of them are going to be acquainted already with a wonderful book on leadership that you put out in 2021. I had heard your name, Rich, over the years as a missionary in Kenya. World Vision has a presence there in Kenya that's pretty impressive. And, you get to the end of the road, I think you said before we started this interview, and you get beyond where the road stops, and you're going to find World Vision folks out there. So appreciate all the work that you did in developing that country of Kenya. But I was familiar with your name, but then it wasn't until 2021 when you released this book entitled Lead Like It Matters to God that I have a chance to hear your story and to read a leadership book that's not like most other leadership books, and tell our listeners why in the world you decided, especially since you start off the book saying, I hate reading leadership books, why you decided that God wanted you to write one about leadership.
All of the books I had written before this were about poverty and justice issues, my role at World Vision and what I saw when I traveled around the world and trying to lift up those causes to the American church in particular. So writing a leadership book was kind of a different kind of segue for me. But having served for many, many years in both secular and sacred leadership positions, I'd accumulated a fair amount of wisdom and a fair amount of insights into leadership. And I thought maybe I could share those with younger leaders.
Really, the book is about values-based, character-based leadership and not on success. And you spent a fair amount of time at the beginning of the book saying success isn't really what's important to God. And if you want that well done, my good and faithful servant, it's not going to be quarterly reports and so forth and numbers of people that sit in the chairs, but it's really going to be about character and values, personal values. As I look at the list of 17, Rich, there's no question in my mind that secular leaders would just affirm most of them, if almost all of them, but a couple of them stand out to me as maybe very special. One of those is forgiveness. Another would be trust. I don't think too many people would speak against trust, but you talk a lot about forgiveness, and you even work it into your chapter on integrity. You spend more time talking about forgiveness in your chapter on integrity. Mm-hmm. So talk to us just a little bit, because I want our readers to go out and buy this book, but talk a little bit about forgiveness and how important that is to great leadership.
Yeah, so I think the forgiveness value, the characteristic of being a forgiving person, it cuts both ways as a leader. People that work for you are going to make mistakes, right? They're going to fall short sometimes. They're going to fail to achieve their goals. So a leader's ability to forgive someone that works for them, to say, hey, it's okay. You made a mistake. You learn from the mistake, and we're going to move on. It's okay. You're forgiven. You've learned, and we can move on past that. That gives such grace to people who work for you. People are often a bit fearful of the leader, right? Because the leader has the power to fire them, to remove them from their jobs, to do other things to make their life difficult. And so when a leader is willing to say, hey, it's okay. We all make mistakes, and we can forgive this one and move on. It's very life-giving to the culture of the organization as well, and it helps reduce the level of fear and anxiety in the culture of an organization. And when the culture of an organization is healthy and it's not filled with anxiety and worry and concern, people are more productive, and it just helps everybody succeed and do better. But it cuts the other way too. Leaders make mistakes. And when leaders make mistakes, if they have the wherewithal to say publicly, hey, I was wrong on this. I got this wrong. I made a mistake in leading this organization in this way or making this decision, and I just ask for your forgiveness. Wow, that is so unprecedented in most organizations, because most leaders are not willing to show that kind of vulnerability. But it shows that you're human. It shows that you're approachable. It shows that you can challenge me as the leader because I'm not always right. Just because I'm the leader doesn't mean I'm always right. And there's a sense of healing in the organization as well when you forgive. One of the things I talk about, I think you're talking about this in the excellence chapter, is how most people, as they move through an organization, they bump into other people, right? There's some elbows are thrown, some harsh things might be said in meetings. So you can, over time, end up having a grudge with Mary, a grudge with David. So-and-so said something that made you angry, and so you're going to find a way to get back at them. And before you know it, you're carrying all of this baggage through the organization of little slights and grudges that people that have said things or done things that upset you. And if you can just forgive all that, you don't even have to forgive them verbally. If you just say, look, I'm not going to hold grudges. I'm not going to be that person. You will be so much more effective in your working relationships. They won't be crippled by all of these little anxieties and grudges and things you hold against other people. So I think forgiveness is a very important quality in both a leader and someone deeper in the organization who wants to be a leader someday and wants to move up.
Well, I bring it up because as I started, I don't find it mentioned very often, if at all, in secular leadership books or in summits that I attend. And it also seems, be interested in your comments on the cultural moment that we're currently in with such partisanship and such, culture wars that, boy, forgiveness seems like it is a rare commodity these days and therefore impacting secular and Christian leadership.
It really is. And as I think about the political divisions, let's just take the Christian world, they are deep and significant. And yet I always remind myself that the same people who I disagree with politically are wonderful people. They're generous, they're caring, they're good family people. You just have to remember that we can't demonize people because of one dimension of their lives. And we would hope they would not demonize us for one dimension of our lives, that reasonable people and good people can often disagree on political issues, theological issues. That doesn't make them a bad person.
In differentiating leadership in the secular world versus in a Christian nonprofit, what would you say are the things that are the same, but then there are things that are dramatically different in leading those two entities?
When I moved from Lenox, China into World Vision in 1998, I frankly knew nothing about global poverty. I had never been to Africa or to a developing world country. I was a really odd choice for the board to make in retrospect. So I was fearful as I came into that job, like, well, why me, Lord? I mean, I don't have any of the skills and qualifications. I sometimes talk about Peter, I identify with him. He was a fisherman. He was not, trained to be the leader of the first century church and to follow this rabbi. He wasn't a scholar. He didn't have any of the things you would normally look for on a resume as he, decided to follow Christ. But the Lord, brought me there, and I very quickly could see that a lot of things were the same. World Vision had a finance department, a human resources department, a marketing department, a sales department. All of those were very familiar. I sometimes say it's like if you're a pilot of a 737 and somebody put you in the cockpit of a 747, yes, there are differences, but there are more similarities than there are differences. So that was the first realization that, hey, I know some of this stuff. I know how to manage an organization like this. There was a lot I had to learn as well. I had to learn the whole ministry side or the field side of our work around the world. And that took, as you said, several million air miles to go over there and meet people and learn about that. But a lot of very similar things. What I did find, Mike, is that the cultures were very different. Most leaders who make transitions, even in the for-profit world, if they fail, they fail to adapt to a new culture. And a Christian culture, a ministry culture, a nonprofit culture was very different from a for-profit culture in the luxury goods business. So it required a fair amount of adaptation and understanding cultural differences in the organization of World Vision. Just one highlight, because I don't want to belabor it, but World Vision is mission driven, and it's not just mission driven, it's Christian mission driven. So the people that work there, it is not just a job. It is their job and their career. It is their Christian family, and it is their calling, and all of their theology is wrapped up in that as well. So they have a lot more at stake They can't just say, oh, yeah, I work for Nordstrom and that's just my job. But the person I really am is this person over here. So people that work at Christian ministries bring their entire persona to work with them. And as a result, they have a lot more at stake and they want to be more involved in decisions that are being made, because these are decisions that affect their career, but also their faith and their calling and all of these things. I used to say, leading World Vision, we had 1,100 employees in the U.S., and it was like trying to lead 1,100 people, each individually called by God in a different direction. And I think that's true of a lot of Christian ministries. You're leading people that feel called, but you have to lead them in one direction when they may be called in various different directions.
Well, Rich, in your book, Lead Like It Matters to God, you mentioned executive coaching and some of the bosses that you worked for early on. But I'm just wondering if you'd share with our listeners, who were role models in your development of your leadership personality and approach to leadership that led to this wonderful book and the experiences that you had? And were there some events or experiences along the way that really the curve was pretty steep up that led to a higher level of leadership capability for yourself?
I like to say leaders are not born fully formed. We grow into leadership positions. And let me say, I believe that most people listening to this podcast are probably leaders. Now, you might not be the CEO of a hospital. Maybe you are. You might be a leader in your church, or serving on a committee, or serving on a board where you have a leadership role. You're a leader in your family. You're a leader in your practice. So this is not a book just for CEOs and C-suite executives. This is a book for everybody, because all of us are leaders in some dimension of our lives. And leadership, again, it's a learning process. I was a much better leader at age 60 than I was at age 25. You learn from people along the way. Most of us have mentors. We have positive role models and we have negative role models, right? And you can learn from negative role models as well, things not to do. Early in my career, I had two bosses that were very different. One boss who just believed in me. He just said, I'd taken a new job with Parker Brothers Games. I didn't know anything about the industry. And he gave me some early assignments. I was 25 years old. And I'd come to him with my results, and they weren't very good. And he'd say, well, I think you've got this right and this right, but why don't you go out and ask this question and come back to me? And, he kept saying, you can do this, Rich, you can do this. And maybe the seminal moment is we were in marketing and we shot TV commercials for our new games. So he took me on a commercial shoot to New York City. A lot of money was at stake. These commercials are expensive. You've got a director and a producer, and you've got to rent a facility, and you've got to hire talent and all this. So he took me to see all this and walked me through the process. 6 months later, we had to shoot another commercial, and he said, you can do it. You don't need me to be there. You go. And I'm 26 or 7 at this point, and I'm saying, you want me to do this and lead the ad agency and all of this? He said, yeah, you can do it. I believe in you. And he was a boss that just always said, I believe in you. You can do it. He was an encourager, right? An encourager.
Yeah.
A few years later, I had a boss at Parker Brothers who did a performance review on me. This good boss had left and gone to another company, and I had a new boss. And he sat down with me and he said, I don't think you're cut out for this kind of role. I don't think you're cut out for marketing. And I said, well, I don't understand. I mean, I have an MBA from Wharton School in marketing. I've done pretty well so far. Anyways, he was all negative in the performance review. You got to do this, and you're not dressing the right way, and you're eating lunch with the wrong people in the cafeteria. And he had all of these negatives. Well, anyways, if I'd listened to him, I don't know where I would have gone, but because of that first boss, I believed that I could overcome this. And 3 years later, that boss was gone, and 5 years later, I was president of the company. So, but I attribute it to that encouraging boss that I had.
You certainly took some risks, and you were courageous. You have a chapter on courage, and clearly to be a values-focused and values-defending kind of leader, it sometimes does cost you. And you have a whole chapter on sacrifice as well.
The whole thrust of my book is to encourage people to take God to work with them. Take your whole self to work. I think there are a lot of Christians, especially in the for-profit marketplace, who work in very difficult corporate cultures, maybe toxic cultures for toxic bosses. The phrase, it's a rat race or it's a jungle out there. I mean, a lot of people have used that to talk about the business world. So it's very tempting to go and check your faith at the door on Monday morning, right? I'm a Christian, but when I go to work, in fact, I write in my book, on Sunday we hear a sermon about putting on the full armor of God, but on Monday morning I got to put on the full armor of the world because it is a jungle out there and it's a dog-eat-dog world. And so I think there's a lot of Christians that are secret Christians. They go to work and they've got a different persona at work because they're adapting to the culture of that workplace. That might mean they swear like Marines, that might mean that, they tell off-color jokes, whatever that workplace is. And then Friday night at the end of the work week, you pick up your faith again at the door and take it back home for the weekend. And what I encourage Christians to do is, no, you've got to take your whole self to work. You're God's ambassador in that workplace. You are God's ambassador for Jesus Christ in that workplace. And sometimes that's going to help you because everybody wants a boss with integrity and fairness and a boss who's understanding and kind. And sometimes it's going to hurt you because the culture will reject you like an organ transplant. The culture will try to spit you out. As you mentioned, I got fired once for not being willing to adapt to a culture that was very toxic. And when I got fired, they told me it was like, we're firing you because we can see you don't approve of the way we run this company. And that makes us feel uncomfortable because I was a vice president and they said it wasn't your work. It was just, you make us feel uncomfortable. And so sometimes that's going to cost you something, but hey, God never promised us an easy road. And we are called to go into the workplace with our whole self, bringing our whole self to work.
Well, Rich, clearly leaders are often made or unmade in crises, and you faced a few at World Vision. Just a few months after I became CEO at CMDA, we had in 2020 a pandemic with COVID-19. But for you in '98, when you took the helm at World Vision, there was a pandemic at that time as well, which continues to this day, and that's the AIDS crisis. And I remember in 1996 when I landed in Kenya and sat around a circle with a small group of missionary doctors wondering how we were ever going to be able to make it and avoid the hospital being completely taken over and all the beds filled with AIDS victims. And just within the next few years, trying to convince supporting churches to help us with the AIDS crisis and even wanting to speak at a missions conference on the face of AIDS in Africa. And they really pushed back. Like, that's not a theme necessarily we want to hear about. Not understanding what AIDS looked like in Africa at that time. That it's a heterosexual disease, transmitted, many widows and orphans as a result. Many women who had AIDS that we found that we treated that really were not promiscuous, but their husbands had been. You walked onto the stage, a global stage, and somehow over the first several years, you convinced church and donors that this was something the church needed to engage in and to fight. How did you do that, Rich?
Well, it's an interesting story, Mike, because my very first trip to Africa in 1998, I'd been 60 days earlier, I'd been the CEO of Lenox China selling dishes to the wealthy. And 60 days later, I found myself in Rakai, Uganda at ground zero of the AIDS pandemic. And like a lot of American Christians, I was totally unaware of what AIDS was doing in Africa and other parts of the developing world. I knew AIDS as part of the culture war in the United States. Most people don't remember, maybe they do, how stigmatized AIDS was in the United States because it was considered a disease of the gay community. And, a lot of religious leaders were saying, well, they're getting what they deserve for their immorality. There was a lot of judgment. There was a lot of stigma. Because it involved sexual immorality and sexual transmission, a lot of Christians didn't want anything to do with it. It kind of shut down the compassion that we normally feel for people that are suffering from a disease. So I came back from Africa, just blown away by what I had seen. I had met AIDS orphans, child-headed households, 3 boys, who were like 13, 10, and 9, who lived in a mud hut with the graves of their parents out in front of their house. Both parents had died, and these boys were living totally alone. And then I was told there were 13 million children that had lost one or both of their parents to AIDS in Africa at that time. And it felt like a gut punch, like, how did I not know about this? And then I thought, why isn't a catastrophe of this magnitude all over the television? Why isn't it on CNN and Fox News and everywhere? Why is not every pastor in America talking about this from the pulpit? Where's the church? Where's the government? Where's the rescue mission to help with this pandemic? Because it was eviscerating a whole generation of Africans and leaving orphans in its wake. And so I came back to, naively, I came back as the new guy to World Vision, and I kept talking about this to my vice presidents and my marketing people. And we had a big summit meeting, and I just said, we just need to respond to this, and we've got to do it in a big way. And everybody's looking at each other around the table like, should you tell them or do I have to tell them? Somebody's got to tell them. And finally, the vice president of marketing said, Rich, with all due respect, kind of you're the new guy here. You were selling dishes a few months ago. He said, World Vision is a G-rated ministry. We're about children and families, and AIDS is an R-rated issue. And he said, Christians and churches will not support this, and it will damage our reputation on top of this. If we go there, it's going to damage our reputation. And I just said, well, listen, I've listened to all of you today, but those Christians and those churches are wrong. And if we don't tell them they're wrong, who's going to? I said, this is our Esther moment. If we fail to speak up at such a time as this, God will raise deliverance for these folks that are victims of HIV from another place. And he'll remove his hand of blessing from World Vision. We have to speak up. And so we're going there. And it was like, oh my gosh, they were freaked out. They insisted on doing a Barna survey to prove their point. So over the next few months, we did with Barna. And they asked evangelical Christians one simple question: would you be willing to make a donation to a reputable Christian organization that was helping children in Africa who had been orphaned by AIDS? Only 3% of evangelical Christians said, I would definitely be willing to do that.
Wow.
And more than half, it was one of those definitely, probably not, definitely not. More than half said probably or definitely not, I would be not willing to help. And that's when I realized we got a steep mountain to climb. But we were determined. I mean, I finally, we took our theme verse was the verse from James that, this is pure religion, to care for widows and orphans in their distress. And we focused on the widows and the orphans who were the innocent victims, right, of HIV, because it was the men who typically brought it home. And we thought, well, we can go in under the radar of all of this stigma by talking about widows and orphans. And over the next 5 years, I mean, we did help turn the tide with a lot of other Christian leaders who spoke up as well. And I think World Vision probably raised $500 million over the next few years for AIDS orphans and the widows of AIDS in Africa.
I wish I could have listened in on the conversation that you had with your senior leaders after the Barna results and how you still convinced them to move forward with 3% willing to donate. And it says something to me. I was looking at a Barna study just yesterday, Rich, about the future of missions and how we can recruit and words that we shouldn't use and so forth. You took 3%. Your vision was right on target. You knew what needed to be done in spite of low numbers. So I just wonder how we should treat these surveys sometimes about if we have a conviction, a bold conviction about what's ahead and how we carefully negotiate those results of those surveys.
Well, you have to be spirit-driven, God-driven, not survey-driven, right? And that's sometimes that's difficult. A few years later in the 20-teens, just before I retired, had a similar situation with the Syrian refugee crisis because, as you probably know, roughly half of the country of Syria have been displaced as refugees or displaced people, literally 12 million Syrians, almost all of whom are Muslims. And again, trying to convince Americans that we need to respond to this tragedy in the Muslim world was really an uphill battle as well, and continues to be. And I kept saying, what an opportunity that God has opened a door into the Muslim world. And if we go through that door as Christians, it may be one of the biggest opportunities for the gospel in the Muslim world in the last 100 years or longer. And yet so many churches and Christians just kind of folded their arms and shook their heads and say, why should we help Muslims? Why they hate us. Why should we help them? And I think it's been a missed opportunity because most churches didn't get involved with that. Some did, but most didn't.
Well, we were talking with Rich Stearns, who's going to be the opening plenary speaker at our upcoming CMDA National Convention on Thursday evening, April 27th. And Rich, can you just give us a brief preview of what you might be sharing with us? I realize someone with your experience and who's been speaking all over the globe to different audiences, you don't necessarily have to have a ton of preparation for a plenary talk like this. But what are you going to share with our group, nearly 1,000 that meet on that Thursday evening?
Yeah, well, first of all, Mike, I'm very aware of the traumatic impact of the last 3 years on the healthcare profession. I've been doing a little internet research about burnout among healthcare professionals, stress in the lives of healthcare professionals. And I don't have to tell this audience what I mean by that because you've all lived through it. But I hope I can bring an encouraging word that sometimes in the middle of crises, even when we don't see it or feel it, when we're feeling our most discouraged, that's when God is using us most powerfully. And we may not see it even in our lifetime, or we may see it years later when we look back and we realize the impact we were able to have for the Lord during this time of crisis. So I hope to bring some encouraging words to healthcare leaders and professionals after a season of really difficult, rough sledding. But also I hope to bring a few maybe tips to make you a better leader, a better person in the career in which God has led you, things that might be helpful that I can share from my almost 50-year career, lessons I've learned. Some of them I've learned the hard way, and maybe I can help you not learn them the hard way. But mostly I want to encourage that community, that very important community in our country.
Well, in your book, you quote Mother Teresa that God didn't call her to be successful, but to be faithful. And I want to thank you, Rich Stearns, for your faithfulness for 2 decades at the helm of World Vision and for the impact globally in 100 nations, maybe more, the ripple effect during the AIDS crisis especially, which just devastated so many lives. Thank you for your faithfulness, and thank you for saying yes to come and be our speaker here in just a few weeks. I'm very excited, and may God bless you as you continue as President Emeritus of potentially the world's largest Christian nonprofit and its influence in advancing the kingdom. And I think I've yet to read the whole in our gospel. So now that's the next book I've got to read of Rich Stearns.
There you go. Well, thanks, Mike. I really look forward to being part of your community at the convention coming up in April.
The 2023 CMDA National Convention will be here before you know it. Have you reserved your spot yet? We're joining together in the Cincinnati, Ohio area on April 27th through the 30th because we know the value of fellowshipping and worshiping with other Christians in healthcare. This is the place to find resilience in your life, your faith, and your practice. Our speakers at this premier event for healthcare professionals include Professor Robert George from Princeton University, Dr. Kristen Collier from the University of Michigan, President Emeritus of World Vision, Rich Stearns, and many more. We sold out last year, so don't wait to register. To reserve your spot at this year's convention, visit natcon.cmda.org.
Well, this interview with Rich is only a brief glimpse of what we're going to hear at the 2023 CMDA National Convention, which actually starts next Thursday, April 27th. I just learned that we are almost sold out, maybe only 5 spaces left out of 1,000 that we targeted. So I'm excited to announce that we are opening up a virtual option. If you can't attend in person, now you'll have the option to join us for all of the live plenary sessions. You'll be able to chat with other virtual attendees and more. Of course, you'll miss out on some breakout sessions and the annual dinner banquet, as well as that wonderful in-person community and fellowship with other CMDA members. But at least you'll have access to 7 different major sessions with our plenary speakers featured and the worship time together, award presentations, and much more. Virtual registration is now open, so you can visit natcon.cmda.org for more details. Actually, if you'd like to hear even more from Rich while you're at the convention, he's also going to be speaking at one of our breakout sessions during the Leadership and Well-Being track on Friday afternoon. During that session, he plans on taking a deep dive into the concepts that he discusses in his book, Lead Like It Matters to God. And speaking of that book, I hope you'll add it to your reading list soon. Just like we discussed during our conversation today, this book shares the leadership principles that Rich has learned over the course of his career as a leader who's navigated both secular and sacred spaces. Over time, he's proved that the values Christian leaders embrace in their workplaces are actually more important, those values, than the results they achieve, because our God is more concerned about a leader's character than a leader's success. In this book, Rich inspires and encourages us as Christian leaders to boldly take our values into our workplaces in order that we might tangibly demonstrate the character of Christ, the love of Christ, together with the truth of Jesus Christ as we live out our faith in full view of others. You can find your copy online, and we've also included a link to Amazon in our show notes today. For those of you who are attending our convention, now is the time to download the CMDA Go app. And you can add Rich's session to your agenda for the weekend so that you don't miss it. On our app, you can find more information about all of the sessions that are available during our upcoming convention. And plus, you'll be able to connect with the others who are attending the convention on the app. The CMDA Go app is going to be the hub of all of the details that you will need as you attend our convention. So be sure to download it in advance. You can find it in your mobile device's app store, or you can just visit cmda.org/app. Just briefly, I want to talk about the pre-conference sessions that we are offering at the convention next week. Running simultaneously on Thursday afternoon, April 27th, starting at 1 p.m., two of our specialty sections are offering new tracks for you. First is the Christian Healthcare Executive Collaborative, or CHEC track. It's being hosted by the leaders from that section. Those sessions will focus on leadership as well as best practices in healthcare organizations. And second is the Addiction Medicine track hosted by the leaders of our CMDA Addiction Medicine section. This will be a great opportunity to learn about how you can get even more engaged in fighting the opioid epidemic. You'll find more information about these two particular pre-conference sessions by going to natcon.cmda.org.
CMDA Center for Well-Being helps Christian healthcare professionals align with God, optimize well-being, and maximize influence. If you find yourself feeling burned out and overwhelmed by your daily demands, please reach out to our team in the Center for Well-Being. After all, you pour yourself out for others every day, and this is a place to be refilled. Plus, we've been expanding our services in the center to help meet the great needs CMDA members have. You can sign up for certified coaching training courses that prepare you with the skills for coaching those in your sphere of influence. And our team can even help you walk through the difficult challenge of facing a malpractice lawsuit. Plus, we offer marriage enrichment weekends and retreats for our members to refresh and restore their marriages. Our team members have been where you are, and we want to help you through the challenges you face. Visit cmda.org/wellbeing to learn more.
One of the things that stuck out to me from this week's interview with Rich was his comment about how we must be spirit-driven in our work, whether that's in the hospital, in the clinic, serving cross-culturally in a mission setting, or even as we serve here at our CMDA headquarters in Bristol, Tennessee. God doesn't call us to check our faith at the door on Monday mornings. Instead, we're called by our Lord to let our faith show every single day as we lead in our own distinctive ways, A great resource that will help you learn more about this is the book, The Leadership Journal from a Leader's Journey. It's a new book available in our CMDA bookstore that was written by Pastor Burt Jones, who is our CMDA Vice President of Missions and Member Care. It's a journal of principles, quotes, notes, as well as insights from Burt's years of leadership experience that will help you grow and develop in your leadership journey. You can get your copy in our CMDA bookstore by going to cmda.org/bookstore. Next week, I'm going to be joined by George Courtney from CMDA's Stewardship Ministry, as well as Cassandra Lehman from Beacon Wealth Consultants. They join me to share more about faith-based investing and the importance of working with financial advisors that share your values and your beliefs. Hey, if you want to suggest a future guest for the podcast, you can always email your recommendations to us at cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like our podcast, especially if you listen week after week, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share us on your favorite social media platform. If you do listen regularly, you know that I love student testimonies. Those that come from one of our more than 330 campus groups across the nation. I recently received this short testimony from a first-year medical student in Oklahoma who said, "CMDA has shown me how to better reflect Him in my future practice and how I can use my talents to further God's kingdom." That student captured exactly what we've been discussing through this week's interview with Rich Stearns. We are called to reflect Christ in our work as healthcare professionals, as well as on campus for those who are healthcare students in training. Rich has given us some great insight into how to be actively leading like it matters to God as we further His kingdom. I hope that you can apply those principles into your everyday life in the coming days and weeks as you bring the hope and healing of Christ to our world. That's what matters to CMDA, friends, and CMDA matters. I sure hope to see a lot of you next week in Cincinnati at the National Convention. God bless you.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.